most characters will get more competent over the course of a book series or a movie, and your proactivity needs to also change. And then we look at character arcs. So, like, what proportion of it is accomplishment and what proportion of it is self-change. So, for example, Superman will have a lot of accomplishment because he does lots of stuff, whereas self-change is a character who's come across a realization, and that's really important as well, that you have, it doesn't need to be balanced, but you need to include some of both. And so you need to also have handicap and flaws to make it more interesting, so that the character, it could potentially relate. So, for example, in this instance, John Doe was diagnosed with asthma, and there are lots of people out there who have asthma, and so they could potentially relate in some way. He does not like asparagus. Don't know why I put that in there, but I think lots of people don't like vegetables anymore, so they could relate in that way as well. They don't have to relate specifically, but they have to get the general idea, and they have to be able to understand it in some way. The readers, I mean. And if we also look at how the character would describe things, this is very, very important, especially if you are writing one of those books that I've seen coming up more frequently, where your character shifts. It's from the point of view of one of the main characters, but that main character shifts every chapter. A good example of a book like this is Genius the Game by Leopoldo Gaut, and so you need to have a very distinct writing style for each of them. And a very, very, very simple example of that is using swearing versus not using swearing. And this is way to distinguish characters, but I wouldn't use it because it is significantly overused and it limits the fact that you can't target younger readers as well. But that may be what you're going for. In this example, Jane Doe uses very elaborate language because she enjoyed imitating characters such as Artemis Fowl from a young age. This is how it links to her past, and every time she describes the sky, she uses dull because it reminds her of her divorce and her previous marriage. And so that's a relationship, and it's also past. So you need to add other things. For example, obligation. That could be your place in society. And so, for example, if you have been marginalized by a society, you might describe those who have marginalized you in a kind of bad light. And motivations. For example, a character like Gollum, if he was being narrated in first person, he could potentially use language that was more central around what he wants, for example, the ring. And we also look at sensibilities. So, okay, that isn't really what this person would say. You kind of have to use your, you kind of have to think a bit about this because it's difficult to get your character to describe things. And one way you can really get this to work is you have a bunch of your cast of characters, which we just created, and you want to perhaps you want to do this thing, or perhaps you just want more writing practice. But I would recommend you sit down and pretend to be each character, and you write about the same object in a different way, because obviously the characters are going to describe it differently. And it's a great exercise, and it really helps to know your characters more. So I've just
really great. Sorry to interrupt. I'm just saying, if anyone has any questions, I'm sure Artemis would be happy to take them as well while he's going along. If that's all right.
Yeah, I'll check them later on after we've finished each section. So we're nearly finished with this one.
Okay.
So just a few additional notes. You don't build the characters to suit the story. Always build the character first, because the story needs to be around the character, what they want, what their dreams are. And that's also down there. You need to give all characters dreams and quirks because that makes them interesting. For example, if you look at the Netflix series Voltron, a character like Koran has that weird quirk where he always pulls his mustache. And you also need to know that the reader knows the character's motivation, because books can often fall apart and be uninteresting if the reader isn't clear on the character's motivation. And this can be done in a lot of different ways, but I would primarily stick to the main storyline. I wouldn't go off on dialogue, because if you have characters talking about another character's motivation, it can seem like artificialized, because who would do that in real life? And also, definitely don't be sexist or racist. And don't go too far in the opposite direction, where you have an entire cast who is all, say, African American, because then readers will question, why did you do that? They'll also question it if you were sexist and racist. So don't lean too far in one direction or the other unless it makes sense to. For example, in a movie like Ocean's 8, where the protagonist all female, it makes sense because it's run by Danny Ocean's nephew. Oh wait, niece. Sorry, niece. So now we'll move on to setting just after. If you have any questions, if you could put them in the library chat. Needs to click the link. The presentation be uploaded. I will upload it at the end. And I know you can't attend, but it will be there. Okay. Okay. Is Sir Razax and you are they writing questions? I just need to know whether to move on or not.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're writing an historical novel,
Yeah.
you can use like sexist or racist, like because
Yeah.
because to involve
Yeah.
the reader to the
Yeah.
aim.
Yeah, that was one thing I forgot to mention. Thanks for bringing it up. If you want to prove a point that like sexism or racism is bad, and it suits what you're writing, for example, historical fiction, I would recommend you don't need to use it though, and but it would be
Okay.
important, especially if it's historical fiction, and it was a big problem at the time. If you pointed that out, and then that could help make the readers understand the character's motivation, and also help them it could also help them understand their motivation and also help them align with the characters.
Mhm.
Is that
Okay. Thanks.
I would build all characters, because the plot has to reflect what all of the characters want, because all of what the characters want will impact individual events. Because a villain is just created for the don't create a villain to make the main character look good. The villain has to be created for a reason. For example, the villain has something that the character wants. That's a typical example. No. The villain has to be built, if there is a villain at all, because generally it's not good or bad. It's kind of a combination. The villain has to be built around. It has to be logical. So you have to have a character, and the main character. So the villain is created for the. But so you mean antagonist instead of villain, correct?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So the antagonist has to be created around what the protagonist wants or what the main character wants, because otherwise there's no reason to have an antagonist. For example, if you take Artemis Fowl is greedy initially. He wants more money. And in the third book, for example, the Eternity Code, the villain or the antagonist is created to kind of. He's created to rival Artemis Fowl because Artemis wants to be the best, and so it becomes quite difficult if there's a rival. So, yeah, you definitely need to build the antagonist around. I would suggest you start with one main character, and then you build other characters around that, as well as the setting and the plot, because it really has to reflect on what the main character's motivations are and what the main character's hopes and dreams are. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So now if we move on to setting. So there are two types of worlds. The first is a first world, which is set on Earth. So this is for example, your historical fiction. You would set it on Earth, most likely, in a place that already exists. And so a place that already exists in this real world. So, for example, it doesn't necessarily have to be Earth. It could be the moon. But it's real. And you need to make it clear that to the readers that that's where it is, and so the characters are from there, and you have to make everything fit together with the setting. The second world is where a lot of people write, because it's their own fictional location, and they fill this with their ideas and what they want to see in a fictional world. And so just a few ideas. You need to create a map. This could be a screenshot from Google Maps. It could be a drawing you did. For example, the screenshot for Google Maps would be for a first world. And you need to make sure all locations make sense. Why is a fountain there? Oh, because this race, they're very much into beauty, and so they have lots of these different, not really used ornaments that are always polished, and that's why that's there. So you need to explain that. This is kind of similar to what James Cameron did when he made Avatar, because it made sense to have those things there. He would always question the artist's work. Why is that there? And I think that's a really, really good way to do your world, because it makes sure you think about everything. And the character should fit and suit the world. You need to build the world around them, as I've already said. And you can borrow things from this world. For example, a unicorn is just a horse with a horn. It's not like you have to be 100% original. If you look at examples like Aragon, okay, dragons already exist, elves already existed in Tolkien's work, so did dwarves, and so did other of the fictional races. And for example, the new races like Urgles they're based off what we have in real life today, and you'll even see that in description. They're related to real life animals we have today. For example, another character, the Razak, they have these little beaks, and obviously that's based off birds, because birds have beaks in this world. Remember, there's also a cultural world, so you need to think about the culture. And for example, if we can break culture down into a few things, you've got important times of the year. So you've got things like the New Year or various festivals throughout the year. And you've got different rituals that happen. For example, going to church on Sunday would be one. And you've got other things that people don't necessarily think about, and you don't have to create unless you actually need them, such as a religious text, such as the Bible. And does anyone have questions about the setting? No? If anyone does have any questions, put them there. I'll come back after we talk about language very, very briefly. And in terms of language, whoops. Sorry, that's not supposed to be there. Dang. It's supposed to have plot. Language is later on. So is this story about... These are the main... These cover 99% of all the storylines. So you've got comedies, tragedies. An example of that would be Romeo and Juliet. Conquering the monster, or a quest. That would be Lord of the Rings. The Journey and Return, that could also be Lord of the Rings. A Rags to Riches Tale, think a whole bunch of biographies. It doesn't have to be non-fiction though. It can be fiction. For example, another example of that would be Eragon, where Eragon goes from farm boy to dragon rider. And A Rebirth. Now this isn't about dying and being born again. It's more about changing the personality. Like Darth Vader, he goes from being a really, really bad criminal, if we can say it that simply, and then he eventually helps out and he turns good in the end. And then an underdog story. This is very, very this isn't as common as the other ones, but it's interesting because you get to like work on your character development a little bit more, because they change significantly throughout the story. And there are a few elements of a great plot. First, and probably the most important, is you need to make promises. And as I said before, fulfill these in surprising, satisfying ways, and yet try to make these promises slightly different. So what I mean by promises is you have to foreshadow things. You have to for example, we might know something is happening and we're just waiting for it to happen. This is classic horror. And then we move on to the two different types, if you can simplify, of a plot. So you've got character versus setting, and you think like a haunted house. Or characters versus characters, and you can just think Star Wars for that one. And you need to start with a hook. This is also related to making promises. It's where a character wants something, and you need to promise it to the readers, but then draw it out, but don't draw it out too much. And then you do not info dump. This is a massive mistake that I see lots of people making. This completely destroys the hook, and the readers get so bogged down that eventually they'll just put it down because they get tired of reading something that is so. I know you want to include details, but don't describe everything with 5 adjectives. There's a common example where this goes wrong. It's called the maid and butler dialogue, and it's where these two characters, or perhaps even more, are just talking about the setting for no apparent reason. And it doesn't make sense. The readers can't understand why they're doing it, and therefore they lose interest. And also, and I'm sure you've heard this when you're in prep school, you need to make something go wrong, but it has to make sense. Don't have something go wrong that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Like, this guy returns from the military and he's walking, and then he falls down, and somehow that gives him it hurts his leg, and it needs to get chopped off, and so that starts his story. Then you've got nothing to work from. You don't really see what the character wants, unless you aim towards he wants to be able to walk properly again. But it doesn't make sense unless you actually explain why this falling down impacted this dude's leg. And so you need to be really, really careful that you don't have something that doesn't make sense. We move on to plot frameworks. No more questions. Plot frameworks. So there's the typical 3-act one. First of all, we've got the introduction and setting, and then the crisis happens. Now, this first one is taught to you at a very, very young age, and it's still probably the best idea. And then you've got a protagonist that tries things and they fail, and then there's a do or die moment, like in Star Wars, where they're stuck in that compressor, and it's all R2-D2. And then the final act is where all the promises are fulfilled and there's a satisfying conclusion. Make sure it's a satisfying conclusion that the readers can accept. Yeah. And then there's the hero's journey. This is one that you can you can find it. There's a TED talk on it. I think it's called The Hero of 1,000 Faces or something like that. But it's very, very interesting if you look at all of the examples of stories. This could be a breakdown of the 3-act thing, so you could fit it into the 3-act thing. Okay, let's do this in the example of Eragon. I'm sorry if I spoil it for you. If you don't want it spoiled, you can just deafen yourself. So he starts at home, and he's a farm boy, blah blah blah. The character changes because he gets the egg, and he meets his mentor, Brom. He then enters a different world by becoming a dragon rider, and there are trials. Now, number 4 and 5, trials and mentor dies, get switched around. So in this example, Brom dies first, and then there are the trials where he has to go and battle Durza. And then the hero gets an item, which is typically magical. In this case, it would be probably Brom's ring, Arden, which he later uses to move an entire pile of rubble. Then the character supposedly dies, and this could be a metaphor. It doesn't have to be them actually physically dying. It could be that they lose something and therefore they lose motivation, and then they return or are born again. And this once again is very, very it's interesting. So when in number 7, when Eragon dies, that's when he gets his scar, and that's when he can't really do much, and he feels really, really bad about it. He has these intense pains, and he will black out during events. And then when Returns is born again, the dragons give him the gift, and they heal him, and they turn him into this weird hybrid half-elf thing. And then 9 is Understanding. That is straight after that, where he learns so much about everything with his heightened senses, in the stump scene, where he's sitting on the stump and listening to the entire forest around him. Then gains Power. That will be a whole 2 books later, where he gets the Eldonari, and then Return is after the final battle when he returns home. Now, this is kind of debatable how it works, but the idea is it's a cycle, and so at the very end of Return, it starts again. And this is kind of what I believe the writer Paolini is intending to do with book 5. And you need to make these frameworks original, because otherwise people will feel like you've regurgitated other ideas. And so you need to make your characters passionate about your own passions. For example, Eragon is passionate about the wildlife, and going hunting, and listening to said wildlife. And these are things that the author was very much into because he lived by a forest and he went walking there every day. You need to change the setting. If you look at one of the main inspirations for Eragon, which was The Lord of the Rings, obviously because it's got many of the similar races, they changed the setting completely. Initially, you start because you get the whole under the whole dwarf thing is and it's a massive. I don't actually know how to explain this bit, but the Varden are in this underground place. That's where the rebels are, and there isn't really a similar faction in Lord of the Rings, because the elves are very much open, because they live where everyone knows they live, by the river. And so just some additional ideas for making your story interesting. You need to have these words, but and if you're writing a plot out. The character succeeds at said thing, but they lose something important to them. But they can't remember something because they lose part of their memory. These are just a few examples. And so the character fails and they gain more knowledge on their situation. The character fails and they learn a new trick. And this could help them succeed in the near future. The character fails and they realize there's another way around. Now, I'm just going to talk briefly about creating language, just after I check to see if anyone... Ego death 2. Yes. Yeah. Yes. It's... Yeah, it could be an ego death, because when that happens, it is kind of a lowest point, so thank you for putting that in. It's where your character, he or she or it, feels as if they're dead, or feels as if they can't continue, feels if they've been changed and it prevents them from doing what they're previously doing. It's not necessarily death as in dying, or a death as in... It's super broad. You can find ways to do this yourself, incorporate it into your writing style. And you look at some examples, just put on some Netflix or read a new book. If you're reading a new book, I'd recommend reading Artemis, Fowl if you haven't already. And I'm just going to talk briefly about creating a language. And it has to be consistent, because you don't want a language that sounds like it's 500 different languages all spoken at once. And it sounds kind of disjointed and it doesn't work. They all need to be similar. And if you can't do this yourself, or if you're struggling to, I'll show you a website in a moment that can do this for you, but you still have a lot of creative control over it. Your individual words need to have cultural sense. So why is this the word for people? Is it because it's a word for the one, or it's a word that describes them? Like, I believe Urgles means the horned ones, because they have these massive, like, ram-shaped horns. And the mood also must reflect the race or culture you're creating for. For example, one way to do this, and it's very, very complicated, so I'd recommend you don't do this. But if you want to, you could look at how vocal cords work. And if you look at the size of the vocal cords for your race, for example, if they're super small, the vocal cords will also be super small, and therefore they'll speak in a higher pitched voice. If they're massive, their vocal cords will be larger, and they'll speak in a lower pitched voice. This is basic, but you can also look at the shape of their mouth to see what kind of consonants they'll be able to enunciate clearer, and you could incorporate that into your language. Now, there's a site called vulgarland.com, and I would use that personally. I've got an account, and I think it's about $15 or $20, but initially it's free to create a 200-word dictionary. Then for 2,000 words, it's $15, and for 5,000 words, which is the one I've got, it's $20. So it's a worthwhile investment. And so if you don't want to have it specified for anything, you just click Create New Language, and it does it here. And it's got the phonetic spelling, and it's got the different sounds, and it's very much in detail, and spelling rules, syllable structure, and the phonological changes. And you've got grammar as well. So it essentially creates an entire new language for you. And you could speak this because it is that in depth. And so we've got numbers and pronouns and verbs, and then you've got the actual dictionary. And if you go in here, and I believe it's spelling. No. You can choose what language you want to base it off by using the same vowels and consonants. So say we want a language based off Spanish. Then we go generate new language. And it has all of the same consonants and all of the same vowels. And it won't sound similar. It will sound kind of similar, but it'll be different because it's randomized. And so Proj Blogril Blorprid Frol Promros Proj Quenton Pegril Quespis Prorsoj Silde. Now, I'm not very good at this because I actually can't read this here, the actual correct IPA pronunciation. But you can put this into an IPA thing online, and it will work. So if you want to do that, then I'd recommend it, because it's a worthwhile investment, especially if you're going to be creating lots of different languages. So if we go on to magic systems, we're just going to talk about magic systems briefly, because they don't. They're really based on what you want to do. Now, this is only for fantasy, but you can incorporate these kinds of things, and you can make them make scientific sense. And that would be called a hard magic system, which is where there are very, very strict rules, and if you disobey these rules, you die or you're punished somehow. For example, in Eragon, all of the tasks take the exact same amount of energy as if you were to do them in real life. So if you use magic to do something that you can't do physically, you'll die, unless you have the energy source of something else. And so I would recommend you use this when readers understand how it works. And only use it when readers understand how it works. Because otherwise it'll seem like there are all these very, very strict rules, but it's for no reason whatsoever. But on the side of the spectrum, a soft system is very, very much based on or the readers don't know how it works. And if you look at someone like Gandalf, for example, we don't know how his magic works unless you're Tolkien. And that's good because it gives us that sense of wonder and it makes us want to be a child again. And that is one reason why some people like soft systems so much. If you look at Harry Potter, for example, soft system, it's kind of a combination of both because you have to say the exact words and you have to aim in approximately the right direction. And so it's slightly leaning towards a soft system because there are no very, very strict rules. You can't die by casting a spell unless that's your purpose. And so I wouldn't suggest going all the way over one side or all the way over the other side. I would suggest you be somewhere in the middle. For example, an example of one that's slightly leaning towards the hard system would be Avatar: The Last Airbender, where there has to be the element you want to bend near you, and you also have to be possessed with the ability to bend it in the first place. But you can do it however much you want, and so it'd be kind of in the middle. And that concludes my presentation for today. Are there any questions? You can unmute yourself now if you want to. No? No one has any questions? Okay, I will put the presentation in the Discord server. Oh, thanks, Moonchild. That's great. And thank you for attending. I hope this really impacts your writing, and I hope you still retain your original writing style while making stories that your readers can relate to more, and they're able to follow and get hooked into.